Hi, I'm Ben Rossi from the University of Michigan, and today we're going to be talking about a moral assessment of the Eighth Amendment, one of the more controversial amendments in our Constitution. So for starters, the Eighth Amendment states that excessive bail should not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted for crimes. I'll be responding to a prompt regarding John Stuart Mill's speech in favor of capital punishment essay, where he discusses the belief that the death penalty is a more proper punishment than life in prison without parole because it bears a greater deterrence factor against future crimes and is less cruel by reducing the amount of suffering a criminal undergoes. While I agree with Mill's points surrounding the flaws regarding life in prison without parole in comparison with the death penalty, I personally cannot condone the usage of either. As a proponent of moral education theory, I believe that both the death penalty and life in prison without parole are inhumane and do not allow prisoners a chance at redeeming themselves to society, which I believe should be the preferred goal when punishing criminals. Now, right off the bat, I think it's important that we go over all the three theories, which are deterrence theory, moral education theory, and retributivist theory. So deterrence theory has a utilitarian principle, and that the right policy is what maximizes happiness and minimizes suffering. Deterrence theory revolves around the idea that punishment inflicts suffering, so it's justified only if it prevents more suffering than it causes. The punishment is justified if and only if it prevents crimes that produce more total suffering than the punishment it inflicts. In this case, proponents of deterrence theory believe that punishment does deter crime by giving people incentive not to commit crimes. Moral education theory is a little bit different in that it sees punishment as not evil to convict. Essentially, moral education theory tries to teach the prisoner a lesson by making the prisoner a better person, giving them a chance to redeem themselves to society, repair any branches with those that they've wronged, and enable peaceful functioning between both parties. There are two main branches of moral education, and one is a clinical aspect where prisoners is being seen as rehab, and the second is education and teaching people to do what's right. Finally, we have retributivism, which is a little bit difficult to say, so pardon any mispronunciations I have. Essentially, retributivism is punishment is justified because the legally culpable deserve it. Now, classically, the hardline retributivism would be that only the guilty may be punished, all guilty must be punished, and punishment should fit the crime. However, in recent years, it's been modified as saying all the guilty may be punished, but mercy or pardons are sometimes okay, and graver crimes should be more gravely punished. This leads to the remainder of my essay, which I'll be going back and forth from my actual written part. So while both deterrence theory and moral education theory both do not support the usage of life imprisonment without parole, I do believe that retributivist theory supports its usage due to its focus on matching appropriate punishments for crimes. This in turn also leads to my view that the Eighth Amendment is neutral and not specifically prohibiting usage of life in prison without parole, as its subjective definition of cruel and unusual punishment is completely dependent on the person translating it. Therefore, depending on the severity of the crime and those judging it, the Eighth Amendment's neutrality can be used to both condone and not condone sentencing a person to life in prison without parole, making it ambiguous on its view of this form of sentencing. In assessing the three main points of punishment of deterrence theory, retributivist theory, and moral education theory, it is my belief that only retributivist theory can justify the harshness of life imprisonment without parole. I believe this primarily because of the shortcomings found in other theories. Deterrence theory, favoring the death penalty over life in prison without parole, seeks to minimize suffering for the criminal when we view life in prison without parole as causing immense suffering. Likewise, moral education theory would also disagree, because it would advocate the usage of humane treatment and would not view life in prison without parole as humane. Retributivist theories focus on punishing the criminal on the basis of their crime, allows for the possibility that a retributivist could view life in prison without parole as a proper punishment for a criminal. In his argument for usage of the death penalty instead of life in prison without parole, John Stuart Mill expresses a utilitarian argument for deterrence theory. His argument is anchored in the belief that the human capacity of suffering is what we should cause to be respected, not the mere capacity of existence. Citing his utilitarian beliefs that view the death penalty as less cruel than life in prison without parole. This follows the humanitarian nature of deterrence theory, which aims to minimize suffering and deter with the least severe punishment, something that followers of deterrence theory would not see in the sentencing a person to life in prison without parole. Mill also argues that the death penalty provides the highest form of deterrence compared to life in prison without parole, as the threat of death brings about the most fearing people, thus deterring them from committing a crime. Now, in terms of moral education theory, followers would also not believe that life in prison without parole is justified as a form of punishment because it would not give the prisoner an opportunity for redemption within society or deter them from committing future crimes. Moral education theory aims primarily to educate the criminal on the wrongness of the crime. Punishment, in this view, is a form of teaching the criminal. While moral education theory aims to deter criminals as well, it is in a manner that is justifiable to the criminal and equivalent to the severity of the crime. This leads moral education theory to have a more humane approach with criminals. Under no circumstances would moral education theory justify sentencing a person to life in prison without parole, as it would not cure the criminal or give those convicted an opportunity to fix their rift with society. This permanence of being in jail for the remainder of one's life with no chance of release, outside of pardons, would then contradict moral education theory's belief in rehabilitating a prisoner so that they may become a contributing member of society again. In contrast, retributivist theory aims to punish the criminal in a deserving manner that corresponds to the crime committed. Retributivism seeks retribution for the criminal's actions in order to maintain the mutual accountability and common good of the community. Harsher crimes then receive harsher sentences and vice versa, leading to the possibility that life in prison without parole should be seen as a necessary and viable form of punishment depending on the extent of the crime. While advocates of the retributivist theory also support the death penalty, they do so under the guidelines that it could be a deserving punishment for that criminal, not taking into account the deterrent effect. Due to the fact that deterrence is not a factor in retributivist theory decisions, it is completely plausible that retributivist theory would support life in prison without parole, as long as it matched the crime, therefore justifying the usage of life in prison without parole. As a believer in moral education theory, I do not view life in prison without parole as a permissible form of punishment for a criminal under any circumstances. While much of this was mentioned previously, I believe that neither the clinical nor autonomous branches of moral education theory would be in favor of this punishment because it would not give the prisoner an opportunity at redemption with society and it would not educate them on the seriousness of their crime in an adequate manner. Moral education theory revolves around the belief that punishment must serve an educative function and demonstrating the severity and unlawful nature of a crime to the perpetrator. Removing the aspect of education leaves the concept of life imprisonment without parole to then contradict moral education theory. As I see it, life in prison without parole is conceived to be the highest form of punishment for a crime, only fitting for a crime of such magnitude. It does, however, fail to teach said criminal the proper lesson in striving to redeem oneself, because it removes any hope for that criminal to live a normal life by removing the incentive of good behavior in order to potentially be given parole. These criminals are essentially condemned and given no hope for escaping their fate. Yet, their fate is simply to live in prison for the remainder of their life without any incentive to behave in a positive or structured manner. I believe that this promotes negative thoughts in the prisoners' minds due to continuous feelings of hopelessness associated with their condemnation. I also view these prisoners as being more likely to learn nothing from their crime and become more prone to violence or poor behavior, therefore contradicting much of the teaching aspect of moral education theory. In order to convey my belief of this slant towards a negative response from the prisoner, I will provide an example. Let's just say a student were taking a class, and on their first assignment, which is worth the majority of their grade, they fail in such a manner that prevents them from receiving anything above a failing grade in the class. What motivation then would they have to continue working hard for the remainder of the semester? As it goes, they could receive full credit for the remainder of the assignments, but still be left with a failing grade. Would that student have any incentive to put forth a positive effort in the class? I say no. Like a prisoner with life in prison without parole, this student is condemned to that failing grade and given the choice to react without an incentive to perform well. Given their situation, the responsibility is entirely on them instead of the system, making the likelihood that they choose to behave positively or negatively completely up to them, without teaching them anything. Due to the fact that life in prison without parole contradicts the teaching aspect of moral education theory, I believe that it cannot be justified. In reviewing the Eighth Amendment, I believe that it is neutral and does not prohibit a person from being sentenced to life in prison without parole, because its subjective definition of cruel and unusual punishment can vary depending on the extent of the crime and the person interpreting it. This reliance on the severity of the crime and the interpretation leads it to be applied on a case-to-case basis, demonstrating times where life in prison without parole is a justifiable punishment and times when it's not. Much of my belief surrounds the dependent nature of the definition of cruel and unusual punishment, which is determined primarily on the severity of the crime in question and the person translating it. While there are certain forms of punishment that are outlawed altogether due to their inability to ever be deemed justifiable, the Supreme Court has deemed life in prison without parole justifiable at times. One notable example occurs in Harmelin v. Michigan, where the Supreme Court upheld the term of life imprisonment without parole due to the serious nature of the crime. In this case, the crime was not viewed as grossly disproportionate to the penalty imposed, and warranted the upholding of life imprisonment without parole. Although there are other cases, such as Salem v. Helm, where life in prison without parole was deemed disproportionate based on the crime, it is still acknowledged that the Supreme Court permits the mandating of life in prison sentences without parole, depending on the nature of the crime committed. In summary, I have argued that in the case of sentencing a person to life in prison without parole, only retributivist theory would support this claim, whereas deterrence theory and moral education theory would not. Retributivist theory does not take into account the deterrence factor of a punishment and could plausibly accept life in prison without parole as a deserving punishment for the crime. In opposition to this, deterrence theory would view life in prison without parole as too inhumane and would find a more humane punishment than the death penalty. Moral education theory would also view this as impermissible, viewing life in prison without parole as a form of permanent condemnation that is not only inhumane, but also unable to properly educate the criminal in an appropriate manner. This leads me to believe that the Eighth Amendment possesses neutrality and that its stance on the usage of life imprisonment without parole relies solely on the severity of the crime and the person interpreting the subjective definition of cruel and unusual punishment. I thank you for your time, and I hope that you found my video interesting and enjoyed it. Thanks again.